The air was still and thick, the stench of decay always present but never strong enough to mask. We'd been out for days, scraping by with the bare minimum. Some canned food, old medicine, and whatever scraps we could scavenge from the ruins that used to be civilization. Water, though. That was something we hadn't found in nearly 48 hours. The sun beat down relentlessly, sapping every ounce of energy we had left. It felt like the world was squeezing us dry, waiting to see which one of us would break first. There. Eric's voice, hoarse but urgent, cut through the oppressive heat. He pointed toward the horizon, where the distant shimmer of a river glinted in the sunlight. We hadn't expected to find anything this far out from the wall, but there it was, snaking its way through the wreckage of old houses and crumbling buildings. The sight brought a flood of emotions, relief, suspicion, and something darker, a gut-deep warning. I squinted, scanning the area, my hand resting on the machete strapped to my back. "We need water," Finn muttered from beside me, his voice cracked and desperate. "We can't keep going like this, Sonny." I didn't answer right away, watching as the others made their way toward the riverbank, too tired and thirsty to consider the risk. My mouth was dry as dust, but something was off. The stories. The dead had been spotted near the rivers, fluids seeping into the water. I'd heard enough horror to know this wasn't just some urban legend. "Kyle, wait!" I shouted as I watched him break into a jog, making his way toward the water with reckless speed. Kyle turned briefly, the sun casting deep shadows across his gaunt face. "It's just water, Sonny," he called back. "We don't have a choice." I cursed under my breath, picking up my pace to follow. The others gathered at the water's edge, already kneeling, cupping handfuls of water to their lips. My chest tightened as I watched them drink, the clear liquid slipping between their fingers. I could almost taste it myself, cool and pure, the way water should be. But then I noticed something. There were stains on the rocks lining the riverbank, dark stains, not mud, not algae, something thicker. The wind shifted and I caught the scent of it, a sickly, rotting odor that made my stomach churn. I grabbed Kyle by the shoulder just as he was about to take another gulp, yanking him back. "Stop!" I snapped. "Something's wrong." He pulled free, glaring at me. "You're paranoid, Sonny. Look at it. It's fine." He gestured to the river, but I wasn't looking at the water anymore. I was looking at the rocks, at the stains, and at the twisted, bloated bodies of two zombies half submerged downstream. They hadn't fully turned. Their skin was sloughing off, bloated and sickly, floating like grotesque balloons in the water. Black ichor leaking from their mouths, polluting the stream. One of them still had its eyes open, lifeless and milky white, but there was something in the way it lay still, watching. I stepped back, bile rising in my throat. "Don't drink anymore," I growled. But it was too late. Kyle had already gulped down enough to quench his thirst. Eric glanced between us, his lips still wet with river water. "What now?" he asked, his voice quiet but trembling with fear. "We can't survive without water." I wiped a hand across my face, feeling the heat of the sun beating down and the weight of my decision pressing hard on my chest. "We need to find another source," I said. "We'll boil this, filter it, whatever it takes, but we can't risk drinking it raw." Kyle rolled his eyes, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You're overreacting," he muttered, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. I didn't care if they thought I was paranoid. I wasn't about to let anyone die. Not like this. The hours passed slowly as we trekked back toward the outpost, the water Kyle and the others had drunk sitting like a ticking time bomb inside them. The heat only grew worse, sapping our strength as we moved in silence, every footstep feeling heavier than the last. By mid-afternoon, Kyle began to lag behind. At first, it seemed like exhaustion, the way he stumbled and slowed, but soon he was gasping for breath, his skin pale and clammy. "Keep moving, Kyle," Eric said, slinging an arm around his shoulder to help him along. "I'm fine," Kyle slurred, though his body told a different story. He doubled over, retching, his fingers clawing at the dirt as he dry heaved. A thin trickle of blood leaked from his nose, and I saw it. The veins under his skin, dark and pulsing. His eyes turned a sickly yellow, the pupils dilated and wild. "Fuck," I whispered under my breath. "It's the water." Kyle coughed violently, spitting blood onto the ground. He groaned, clutching his stomach as his body began to convulse. The others backed away, panic spreading through the group. "Get away from him!" I shouted, but it was too late. Kyle collapsed to the ground, his body twisting and spasming as the infection took hold. His skin began to blister, the veins pulsing as they spread like black tendrils across his flesh. He screamed, a guttural, agonizing sound that sent chills through my spine. And then, with one final spasm, he went still. For a brief moment, no one moved. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the sound of Kyle's shallow breathing. Then, his body twitched. His eyes snapped open, glowing a sickly yellow, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque snarl. He lunged at Eric with unnatural speed, his nails sharp like claws, tearing into the flesh of his arm. Jackson screamed, blood pouring from the wound as he tried to pull away, but Kyle was too strong. He ripped into Eric's shoulder, the sound of flesh tearing filling the air. Blood sprayed across the dirt, pooling around them. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my machete and swung it with all the strength I had, the blade cutting clean through Kyle's neck. His body collapsed to the ground in a heap, his head rolling a few feet away. Eric collapsed too, clutching his arm as blood poured from the gaping wound. The others stood frozen, too shocked to move. "Help me!" Eric gasped, his voice weak. But I knew it was too late. The infection had already taken hold. Kyle's body lay still on the ground, his head resting a few feet away in the dirt. The blood pooled thick and black beneath his neck, soaking into the earth, but the horror wasn't over, not by a long shot. The group stood frozen in shock, their faces pale, still processing what they had just witnessed. But Eric, who had been the closest to Kyle, wasn't faring any better. He sat slumped against a nearby tree, his face twisted in pain, clutching his torn arm, where Kyle's claws had shredded through the flesh. "Help me!" Eric rasped, his voice barely a whisper, his breathing labored. I knelt beside him, trying to assess the damage, but there was no mistaking it. His wound was deep, ragged, and already festering. Blood and dark fluid oozed from the gashes, and his veins, those goddamn black veins, were already spreading from the bite site like creeping vines. He wouldn't survive for long, and the worst part was, we all knew it. "We've got to amputate," I muttered, my mind racing, though I knew it was already too late. I glanced at the others, but no one moved. They were terrified, paralyzed, and I couldn't blame them. The infection was spreading too fast, faster than we'd ever seen before. Eric's eyes flickered, his chest heaving. His skin had taken on a grayish hue, and his body began to tremble uncontrollably, the veins beneath his skin pulsing with each agonizing heartbeat. "I don't want to turn," he managed to choke out, his eyes locking with mine. "Don't let me turn." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in. It wasn't the first time I'd heard someone say that, but it didn't make it any easier. The idea of watching a friend, someone you'd fought beside, slowly rot from the inside and turn into one of them. It was a nightmare you never got used to. Without warning, Eric convulsed violently, his body jerking forward as if pulled by an invisible string. His mouth opened in a soundless scream, and from it came a thick stream of blood mixed with something black, something unnatural. His skin began to bubble and crack, like it was being eaten away from the inside out. I stumbled backward, my stomach turning as the air filled with the sickening stench of rotting flesh. His body convulsed again, harder this time, and I knew what was coming. "Everyone, back the hell up!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet, dragging one of the younger survivors with me. Eric's transformation was nothing like Kyle's. This was something different. His skin split open along his arms, dark liquid oozing from the gashes as his bones shifted beneath, cracking and reshaping into something jagged and unnatural. His fingers elongated, sharp and claw-like, the same sickly black veins twisting their way through his limbs. His teeth had grown longer, sharpened like a predator's, and his eyes were gone. Hollow, just black sockets staring into nothing. And then he moved. With a screech that sounded more like the tearing of metal than anything human, Eric lunged at us, faster than I could have imagined. The younger survivor, Ben, didn't even have time to scream before Eric's claws were buried deep in his chest. Blood spurted out in thick streams as Ben's body twitched, his mouth opening in a silent scream of agony. "Run!" I bellowed, pushing the others away from the scene. The group scattered, feet pounding against the earth, trying to put distance between us and the horror that used to be Eric. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. I could hear the flapping sound above us, faint but growing louder, the ravenous. The noise stirred the panic deeper, a visceral reminder that we were surrounded by threats. I glanced up, catching a glimpse of them. Dark, winged shapes circling high above. They'd heard the commotion, smelled the blood. We didn't have long. Eric, or the thing that had been Eric, was still tearing into Ben's body, its claws making quick work of flesh and bone. The sound was revolting, like a butcher hacking away at meat. And soon there was nothing left of Ben but a blood-soaked pile of shredded organs and bone. I raised my machete, the familiar weight of it somehow comforting, but there was no comfort in what I had to do next. Eric had to be put down. Whatever he had become, whatever the water had done to him, there was no saving him now. But before I could make a move, Eric turned on me. His hollow black eyes locked onto mine, and he screeched again, blood and saliva dripping from his jagged teeth as he charged. I barely had time to react. The machete felt like dead weight in my hands as I swung it up in a desperate arc, but it wasn't enough. He collided with me full force, sending me crashing to the ground. His claws scraped across my chest, slicing through my jacket, but I managed to get my knee up, kicking him off me with all the strength I had left. I scrambled back, gasping for air, my chest burning with pain. "Stay down, you son of a bitch," I growled through gritted teeth as I raised the machete again, this time aiming for his head. The blade came down hard, cutting deep into the side of his skull with a sickening crunch. Eric's body twitched violently, blood spurting from the wound, but he didn't stop moving. His claws lashed out, slicing at my leg, and I barely managed to dodge the blow. "God damn it," I muttered, sweat dripping into my eyes. I yanked the machete free, the blade slick with gore, and swung again, this time severing his head clean from his shoulders. His body slumped forward, collapsing into the dirt in a heap of blood and black fluid. His head rolled to a stop beside me, the black socket still staring emptily into the distance. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, my hands shaking as I wiped the blood from my face. The others were watching, too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. "Keep moving," I said, my voice flat, emotionless. "We don't have time. The ravenous are circling, and we're not sticking around to see what happens next." The silence after Eric's body collapsed was suffocating. His severed head lay in the dirt, his hollow eyes still staring into nothing, black ichor pooling around him. The others stood frozen, their faces pale, barely comprehending the horrors that had just unfolded. But I didn't have time to let them recover. Not with the ravenous circling above and the dead still lurking in the ruins. "Move," I growled, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. "We need to get back to the wall. Now." We broke into a sprint, leaving Eric and Ben's mangled remains behind. I could hear the flapping of wings growing louder overhead. The ravenous were circling lower, their shadows flickering in the dim light, searching for prey. Every step we took, I could feel their eyes on us, their predatory instincts kicking in. We needed cover, fast. The crumbling buildings around us provided little shelter. Their broken windows gaped like empty mouths, offering nothing but more reminders of the world we'd lost. I glanced up again. 3 ravenous, maybe more, were swooping lower, scanning the ground with hungry eyes. "They're getting closer," shouted Finn, panic edging into his voice. "We'll never outrun them," Laura gasped, barely keeping up, her face pale and drenched in sweat. I spotted a dilapidated factory up ahead, its rusted metal doors barely hanging on their hinges. "Inside!" I yelled, motioning toward it. We barreled into the building, slamming the doors behind us. Dust swirled in the dim light, and the oppressive stench of mold and decay filled the air. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, for now. The ravenous screeched outside, their shadows passing over the windows. But they didn't come inside. Not yet. I could hear them scratching at the roof, their talons scraping against the metal, waiting for us to make a mistake. But they weren't the only problem. This close to the river, we weren't safe from the infected either. "I don't think we're alone," I muttered, my eyes scanning the darkened corners of the factory. A low, gurgling moan echoed from deeper within the building, and my blood turned cold. The others heard it too, freezing in place, their eyes wide with fear. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the shadows. Zombies, their decaying forms shambling toward us, drawn by the sound of our frantic escape. "Fuck," I whispered, gripping my machete tightly. The infected were slow, but there were enough of them to overwhelm us if we weren't careful. And with the ravenous circling outside, we couldn't afford to get caught in a fight. "Stay quiet and stick together," I hissed, motioning for the others to follow me. We edged our way along the wall, keeping as far from the infected as possible. But they were closing in, their dead eyes locked onto us, mouths dripping with rot and hunger. Suddenly, one of the younger survivors, Finn, stumbled, kicking a loose pipe that clanged loudly against the floor. The sound reverberated through the factory like a gunshot, and the infected lunged, their moans growing louder, more frenzied. Shit! I swung my machete as the nearest zombie closed in, cleaving its head from its shoulders in one swift motion. The body collapsed in a heap, but there were more coming. Too many. "Get to the back!" I shouted, pointing toward a narrow staircase that led to an upper level. "Go! Now!" Laura and the others bolted for the stairs, but the infected were closing in fast. Their decaying hands reached for us, their rotting teeth snapping as they moved with surprising speed, driven by their relentless hunger. I slashed at them with my machete, the blade cutting through bone and flesh, but it wasn't enough. We were being overwhelmed. "Up the stairs!" I barked, swinging at another zombie, blood spraying across the rusted metal floor. The ravenous screeched outside, and I knew time was running out. The infected were pouring into the factory now, more than I had anticipated. Their moans filled the air, echoing off the walls as they closed in from all sides. We reached the top of the staircase, barricading the door behind us as the infected swarmed below. For a moment, we caught our breath, but it didn't last. The factory wasn't secure. The ravenous were still outside, and the infected were clawing at the doors, their gnarled hands reaching through the cracks. "This won't hold," Laura whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I knew she was right. We couldn't stay here. The ravenous were circling, waiting for us to make a move, and the infected wouldn't stop until they tore through the barricade. "We need to make a run for it," I said, scanning the room for another way out. "The river's close. We can follow it back to the wall." "The river," Finn blurted out, his voice shaky. "But the water." "We don't drink it," I said sharply. "We don't touch it. But it's our only way out." There was a narrow window on the far side of the room, just large enough for us to squeeze through. Outside, the infected swarmed below, but there was a clear path to the river. "Go," I ordered, pushing Finn toward the window. "Move fast, stay low, and keep your eyes on the sky." We climbed through the window one by one, dropping down into the tall grass below. The ravenous screeched overhead, their wings casting long shadows across the ground, but they didn't dive. Not yet. The infected were still inside the factory, distracted by the barricades. We sprinted toward the river, the cold water rushing beside us, but I knew we couldn't stop. The ravenous were circling lower now, their talons gleaming in the fading light. Suddenly, one of the creatures swooped down, its claws raking across Finn's back. He screamed, blood spraying into the air as he collapsed into the river, the water turning red around him. "Keep moving," I shouted, but the ravenous were coming in fast, diving one after another, their screeches deafening. I swung my machete wildly as one of the creatures swooped down, its claws narrowly missing my face. We reached the edge of the wall just as the gates swung open, the guards firing at the ravenous to keep them at bay. We collapsed inside, gasping for breath, covered in blood and dirt, but alive. As I sat there, heart pounding, I took out a scrap of paper and scrawled down the words. Rule 5. Water is sacred. Always test your water before drinking. Some of the dead have been seen near the rivers, their fluids seeping into the water supply. Drinking contaminated water leads to a slow, agonizing death as the infection takes root inside you. Because we learned the hard way. The dead don't just walk. They seep into everything, even the water.